When emergency first responders were overwhelmed by Los Angeles County's most destructive fire yet, a band of surfers, along with their neighbors and friends, stepped up to defend their home turf in Malibu. Their devotion to home drove them to show up for their community during the fire and for years afterward. And now, a model they call the Community Brigade program could change everything, leading to more lives and more homes saved during the increasing wildfires across not just California, but the world. Join reporter Adriana Cargill from KCRW, NPR's All Things Considered, Crooked Media, and more, as she investigates a wildfire story that is not depressing, but is, in fact, a clear hope for the future. Listen now to Sandcastles, an award-winning podcast about home, how we create it, and why we fight so hard for it.
Hey everybody, Quinn here. Today we're continuing with another of our favorite good news themed episodes. A reminder that we're replaying these amazing conversations for a couple important reasons. One, because we all need to hear some good news these days. And two, because there is so much amazing shit happening out there still. No matter what else is going on. No matter how many times you've worn your sweatpants. Now, some of the folks we've talked to in these conversations might have been temporarily pulled into COVID work. And that's super fucking cool. It's like the Avengers of nerds. I mean, more real nerds. But the point is, they'll eventually get back to the things that they're best at. And eventually, they will absolutely change the world. So today, we're talking to Dr. Mohammed AlQuraishi from Harvard Medical School. Now, this cat spent years working on systems biology, only to show up at a conference where artificial intelligence had basically put him out of business. Listeners, in the spirit of BuzzFeed, this scientist's reaction will blow you away. Please enjoy. Welcome to Important Not Important. My name is Quinn Emmett.
And my name is Brian Colbert Kennedy. This is the podcast where we dive into a specific topic or question affecting everyone on the planet right now or in the next 10 years or so. If it can kill us or turn us into a gentler RoboCop, we're in. Our guests are scientists, doctors, engineers, politicians, astronauts, and even a reverend, and we work together toward action steps that our listeners can take with their voice, their vote, and their dollar.
I was just thinking one day it'd be fun if we actually talked to an artificial intelligence so we could add that to the list.
We have to.
But would we even know we were talking to them?
No.
That's the question. Ooh. This is your friendly reminder that you can send us questions, thoughts, ransom notes, and hate mail on important, where do we do, on Twitter.
Yeah,
yes,
Twitter.
At importantnotimp. Or you can email us at funtalk@importantnotimportant.com. You can also join thousands of other smart people and subscribe to our free weekly newsletter at importantnotimportant.com. If you'd like for other human beings to hear your voice on our podcast, you can send us a voice message through the link in your show notes if I remember to put it there. Brian, tell them what we talked about today.
This week's episode is asking if AI just took our jobs. Except imagine our jobs were very, very important to like cancer.
Right. Not these jobs.
Not these jobs. Not this job.
Let me tell you something. These jobs, AI, would have won the Webby.
Oh my, are you kidding? Of course they would have.
Not even close.
We're just losers.
Our guest is Dr. Mohammed AlQuraishi. He is lovely, incredibly thoughtful, so intelligent. Not at all burned by what went down, and we'll get to that. So jet lagged and still just delightful.
Really wonderful.
Such a conversationalist and so hopeful about the future, which I got to tell you, holy shit, is that like a fucking oasis in the desert these days?
Yeah. Keeping hope alive about the future, that is rough.
I mean, that is a cross to bear these days. Well, hopefully people will enjoy it as much as we did and feel like, oh, thank God there's fucking people out there still doing it instead of just like, fuck it.
Yeah. He's doing it
Give
and
me
he's
a little
hopeful,
hope.
so that's good.
I'm into it. All right, well, listen, let's go talk to Mohammed.
Okay.
Our guest today is Dr. Mohammed AlQuraishi, and together we're going to ask, hold on a fucking second, did AI just make me and my life's work obsolete? Mohammed, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
For sure.
We're pumped. Thanks for being here. Let's get it going by just telling everybody who you are, Mohammed, and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a systems biology fellow at Harvard Medical School, and I work on computational biology, specifically on something called the protein folding problem.
Now, before we really dig into this, my reference to protein folding, my first understanding of it was when, I feel like it was in the 90s, and it was is that when they first launched that thing where you could like use your desktop while it was sleeping to process?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Was that fake? Or was that?
No, it wasn't fake. I think it was late 90s probably. But no, what was the real deal? It was the real deal.
Fascinating.
Yeah. They used PlayStation 3s at the time. I think that was the hot thing.
Oh yeah, man.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
To be clear, there was no downtime for my PlayStation 3. My desktop where I was supposed to be doing computer or homework for sure, but PlayStation 3, no. All right, Brian, let's do this.
Let's do it indeed. So Mohammed, what we're going to do is just go over some context for our very fun question here today, and then get into some questions that are very action oriented that get to the core of why we should all care about you and what you're doing. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. So, Mohammed, we'd like to start with one important question to set the tone of things. Instead of saying, tell us your whole life story, not that we're not interested in that, everybody else does it. So we'd like to ask, why are you vital to the survival of the species?
Okay.
I encourage you to be bold, be honest.
That's a very heavy question. Let's see. Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I don't think what I'm doing right now is vital to the survival of the species. But what I do think is true, and it's not just me, but I think the work that I'm doing and other people like me are doing, I hope will be pretty important, certainly in a few decades from now. And there's sort of two angles to this. One aspect of it is this question of synthetic biology, of being able to engineer organisms that do stuff like, clean up the environment, clean up the ocean, or generate energy, or that sort of thing. And I think we're very far away from that right now. But I suspect that the kind of technologies that we're developing today will be sort of foundational to sort of enable the synthetic biology. And so I think, it's unclear right now whether things like climate science will ultimately, or climate change will be sort of impacted by synthetic biology. Mm-hmm. But it's conceivable that, 30 or 40 years from now, it will prove to be sort of one of the key technologies for that. So that's the short term. If you're interested, I can give you the long-term version as well.
Yeah, no, let's do it. I would love to hear the long term of why you're vital to the survival of the species.
Pretty big question,
Brian's already like chipping away a monument to you. Please continue.
Well, no, I should be very clear. It's not certainly not just me. I think I'm speaking about the field as a whole. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in the kind of work I do and other people do, which is building kind of machine learning models for molecular biology. And what I think is particularly exciting, looking further out, maybe in a century from now, is that, on the one hand, you have artificial intelligence creating machines that are very intelligent. And on the other hand, you have sort of bioengineering and biotechnology, perhaps allowing humans to either sort of integrate with machines or sort of be able to kind of be augmented with machines. And what's exciting to me about this is that, for the entirety of our history, of our existence since 20,000 years ago, or what have you, we've basically been very much limited by our biology, right? We see, we hear, we smell, but that's been it. And what I think is very exciting about the future is that we may be able to sort of rewrite the way we experience the world. We may be able to sort of redefine what it means to be human in sort of an experiential sense. And that to me is again, it's a very futuristic thing, but I think it's something that sort of, it's not just about survival, it's about looking forward to the future and thinking about what kind of species we can become. And that's very exciting to me.
It sounds, and we've talked about this before, a lot like how Brian spends his days.
I'm constantly just sitting around thinking, how can we redefine what it means to be a human being?
That's awesome. Well, I mean, in a world where we desperately need more forward thinking and more practical action towards forward thinking, I mean, we like to say, the whole fucking climate change thing is such a ticking time bomb. But if we can not necessarily solve it, because that's a hell of an ask at this point, but slow it down and maybe at some point start to reverse it, there is so much incredible stuff going on simultaneously right now that's laying the foundation for truly some paradigm shifting advances when it comes to technology, or like you said, biology or space, for example. I mean, the whole like, oh, we can send a reusable rocket into space a week after we used it, which sounded insane 10 years ago, and now we do it every week, is going to be all for shit if everything's on fire. But God, man, if we can just get there, some of this stuff might just be pretty amazing.
No, absolutely. And I mean, many of these technologies are sort of double-sided. Right? Take machine learning, take artificial intelligence. Right? On the one hand, there is a fear, a very viable fear, that it may obsolete, human jobs and will sort of result in a chaos. On the other hand, I mean, I think if we can make it work, it could allow us to sort of solve all these various problems, right, including climate change and so on. So it's sure. The question is going to be, what wins, and can we do things in time to sort of ultimately sort of have a good outcome, and that's by no means a guaranteed thing. But I do think that there's a lot of exciting things that are happening, and I think the future can be bright if we sort of smart enough and cooperate together.
I love it. I mean, I feel like we should just end it right there, but I'm excited to dig into the rest of this. All right. So sometimes this little contextual minute I do is pretty wonky. Sometimes it's more philosophical. I'm going to attempt to really kind of define, because I feel like so much of the issue these days is like artificial intelligence is incredible. And even people who are tangentially in on it totally misunderstand where we are or what that even means, much less people who aren't paying attention to it day to day. So this is all to say, Mohammed, please just jump in and as rudely as you can interrupt me and tell me how wrong I am as I kind of give everybody the backstory on what it means and where we are.
Sure.
Does that work for you?
Of course.
Please. Okay, so just to, again, lowest common denominator here is the goal, so that everyone's on the same page for our conversation. Just revisiting some definitions and nomenclature around AI or artificial intelligence. First, AI means artificial intelligence. What does that mean? More or less layman's terms, like a capability for intelligence of some subject matter from something that isn't organic, right? Not a human or a mammal or a fish or something that's otherwise alive. How does that artificial system get intelligent, quote unquote? Well, for a long time, it kind of meant we give it a shitload of pre-programmed rules, right?
Yeah.
And a ton of data. And then the system in question that you've now built uses those rules to execute a program or calculate some now relatively rudimentary equation. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, there's some nuance. So I think decades ago, people were very much interested in trying to build these expert systems. So this whole idea of like rules, right? Can you encode what we know about the world into these systems and then make them intelligent that way? It's almost like teach them how to be intelligent, or rather, sort of build them from scratch with intelligence. I think what's happened in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been this shift toward machine learning. So that the idea there is that you're not sort of hard coding the rules, but instead, as you alluded to, providing the system with data, and it can learn about the world from this data. So there's
kind
a
of
shift.
like, right. And people have used the example of, I mean, I don't know why this didn't make more sense earlier. I mean, of course, we didn't have the computing power for it, but it's as if kind of how a child learns, right?
Exactly.
So deep learning essentially uses these specialized algorithms that use multiple layers, right? Or neural networks, as they call them, to, from what I understand, gradually extract more, for instance, if we're looking at pictures of faces, extract more higher level features from a face. So the first layer might do the edges of the picture, and the next the background or the outline of the face, and the next a nose, et cetera, et cetera. And then it does that on a million other images until it finds every picture with blue-green eyes. Is that a terrible version of how it works?
No, that's reasonable. I mean, and so you hit at the key feature of this, which is that it's trying to sort of build a representation. It's trying to build a way that it can think about the problem. And the way it does that is sort of takes something complicated like a human face, right, and sort of breaks it down into smaller components, into eyes and noses and then edges and so on. So it's the key thing is that it's not only learning, but it's sort of learning to learn. It's learning to sort of organize its own thoughts, or thoughts maybe is too strong a word, but its own representation so that it's sort of amenable to be able to find patterns in the data.
Gotcha. And so it seems to have, and one of these seems to be advancing pretty well. They both are pretty quickly, but one kind of came about, I think, without people realizing. One is, finding images of very tiny tumors in lung cancer by assessing millions of pictures of lung cancer, and the other is to actually produce something. So we're seeing this stuff with deep fakes, where it can actually or these pictures, someone will post a gallery of 30 pictures online and say, hey, these aren't actually real people. These are all drawn by artificial intelligence because of everything it's learned. For our case, what's interesting from what I understand is that deep learning can either be supervised or unsupervised. And I think from what I understand, that is such an important point. From what I understand, it's super limited. It applies to everything from ice cream to artificial intelligence. This is sometimes where there's some big revelation at the end, and the scientists who operate this intelligence go, this is cool. We don't totally know how it got to this conclusion. Kind of like a black box, as they say. So in these, we don't really teach it rules, right? We just, like you said, throw a fuck ton of semi-related data until it finds cat or tumor. So in some cases, and again, this is cutting a huge number of corners, and I like how you said there's some nuance, which, of course, it might be able to start to find those tumors faster or more accurately than, say, a trained radiologist, or sometimes seconds faster or years earlier than a pair of human eyes, and sometimes better than a fleet of trained radiologists. And that's where we start to see things like we have this paradigm shift of a result, right? And it gets published in a respectable scientific or medical journal. And then a science-focused blog cites it in a post. And then the New York Times science section picks it up. And all of a sudden we have this mass media headline that says something like, AI beats radiologist did lung cancer analysis with 94% success rate. Radiology's canceled. Go home, everybody. The machines win. We cured cancer. To be clear, that's not what's happening. It's not the full story. And I love that you, before we even started recording 2 days ago, corrected me on just our intro to this, which is what I'm excited to get into, because it is a tool that we are working alongside, at least for now. And it's also important to notice that these are, again, these are very specialized.
Absolutely. And I mean,
it can't drive a car, right? The same one that finds a lung tumor can't drive a car, or set the temperature in your house, or water your flowers, or play Go, right?
No, certainly not. And in fact, I mean, I think there's almost a sort of a linguistic definition now where AI, or linguistic distinction, where AI is sort of kind of considered this sort of, fairly specific, fairly circumscribed technology that's really application focused, while something like AGI, artificial general intelligence, is meant to refer to something which is kind of more aspirational, that can do something like multiple tasks and sort of go around the world. But that's really much more of a kind of a dream right now. The successes we've had recently are much more in this sort of narrow AI that's right, as you described, is very specialized. So,
but the ones that are narrow, some of them are just making incredible jumps, right? And sometimes it might seem as if it might, or some people might say, it makes your life work seem a little bit obsolete, your profession. So, Mohammed, why don't you just tell everybody kind of how you got roped into this? What exactly happened with your profession and DeepMind to finish getting us up to speed?
Sure. So like I said earlier, I work on this thing called protein folding, which is a field that has to do, I mean, we can go into what that means later on, but basically it's this field that has to do with trying to predict the shape of proteins. And this is a field that's been going on for decades. And I would say maybe around 5 or 6 years ago, people started thinking about using machine learning, using artificial intelligence very seriously, and applying it to this problem. And that's impacted the field. That's made some progress. But what's happened very recently, last December, in fact, is there was this competition that happens every 2 years where people get together and try to do these sort of predictions. And for the first time, there was an entry from an industrial lab, from a research group called DeepMind that's part of Google or Alphabet. And they decided to participate in this competition, and they in fact did quite a lot better than anybody else in this competition. And what was interesting about it is that this group's expertise was primarily artificial intelligence. They did not really have, they had one or two people who had some biochemistry experience, but by and large, their expertise was largely in machine learning, while all the academic groups were almost the opposite. They all had sort of deep expertise in biochemistry, but they were not necessarily machine learning experts. They were sort of they're just learning the ropes in a way in machine learning, and that sort of inversion, I think, was something of a surprise. That suddenly, if you have sort of really deep talent in machine learning, you could tackle a new problem or tackle a problem that you're not familiar with and make a lot of progress, even more so than groups that have been working on it for a very long time. And I think that surprised a lot of people and perhaps made them a little bit uneasy.
I think we shared something about that actually when that news was coming out in our newsletter. It was very interesting.
So could you alluded to this, but could you just take a quick pause and tell us exactly what protein folding is, why it's important, and I guess why you work on it?
Sure. So just again, going to the very basics, proteins.
That's where we live.
Yes,
the very basics.
It's a great place to live. So proteins are basically the molecular machines in our body. Anything that does anything in your body is typically made out of proteins. So they're like little nano machines that stretch, that flex, that extend, that twist, and so on and so forth. The protein folding problem has to do with predicting the shape of these proteins. So every protein is typically made out of a sort of a chain of molecules, and we know what that chain is typically for any given protein. So it's easy to sort of know the sequence that makes up a protein. But how that sequence turns into a three-dimensional shape, that's a very difficult question. That's something that we've been trying to do for almost half a century, and we don't really yet have an algorithm that does that reliably. We could experimentally go and determine that structure, that shape, but that's very expensive. It takes probably $100,000 to do it per protein. Okay. And so being able to develop an algorithm that can do that would be very useful because it would allow us to, in principle, determine the shapes of all proteins, which then would allow us to do things like simulate a cell, perhaps, or begin to simulate a cell, which is what I started out with in the beginning, talking about synthetic biology and trying to engineer biological organisms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's super helpful. Yeah. So this is, feel free to just literally call me a dumbass.
Are you talking to me too? Or just Mohammed?
Yeah.
Can I call
Brian,
you?
That does not apply to you. I told you.
Got it.
But this is professional. So does that, I mentioned at the very beginning, when my Windows 95 computer and my PlayStation 3 were cranking on protein folding, like when my PlayStation 3 was the original DeepMind, right. Were we trying to still accomplish the same thing?
Yes,
or what was that working on?
But there was actually quite a bit of difference.
That feels like the understatement of the century.
Well, it's a bit of a technical distinction. That's why I'm hesitant to sort of say it's a huge difference. But the difference basically is with the thing that you're talking about from 20 years ago, which was called folding at home.
Yes.
What that was is it was really trying to not only predict the shape of the protein, but to actually simulate the folding process itself. So in your body, each protein is initially made in sort of in an unstructured form, and then it sort of dynamically, it literally over time takes on its final three-dimensional shape. And really, what folding at home was doing, and it still is doing, is trying to simulate that entire process. What I'm describing now is sort of a shortcut. It's saying, give me the sequence, and I'll give you the structure. And I'm not going to worry about how we go from A to Z. I'll just give you the final result. So it's a technical distinction, but it's an important one.
Wait, does folding at home still exist?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Oh, yeah,
wow.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have more than a PlayStation 3 now, but I did love my PlayStation 3.
It was a good one.
In fact, I think this is kind of an interesting factoid, but I think collectively, it is the largest supercomputer in the world.
That's so cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does it become Skynet at some point? Hopefully not.
Yes, right? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, so that's an example of a very specialized type of algorithm, right? So it's probably won't become Skynet. No.
Probably.
Probably, he says. Good. This is great. This is all going so
great. You can
great.
almost sleep safely at night.
I don't sleep. It's fine. Don't worry. I know too much.
Hey, so let's talk about misconceptions and hype a little bit. If you were writing, these news article headlines, how would you frame what happened that day and what's happening every day?
I would probably say something like substantial progress made in the protein structure prediction problem by an industrial research lab.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds so much more correct. And also at the same time, you understand like why the whoever's writing for the New York Times wouldn't write that.
Of course.
So I want to get into, and again, like we've talked about, there are more and more of these specializations every day, right? There's so many businesses across every spectrum that are building a version of artificial intelligence into their business. It feels like everybody from the postal service, to Uber to protein folding are building this in. So.
Yeah, I should say, I do think this is one of the fairly extraordinary and almost generational moments in science. I mean, there's only a handful of these things that I think can point to, say, in the 20th century, these kind of transformations. And I think this is one of them. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think there's a lot of hype. But on the other hand, I mean, you don't see these sorts of things more than once or twice in your lifetime. So, in the broader thing. Now, I'm not talking about just protein folding. I'm talking about what you're just referring to, the fact that machine learning is just revolutionizing so many different fields. It's really quite extraordinary.
Look, I have no doubt it's up there with the printing press as far as the liberation of data, right? But when we're talking about practicalities, and we try to really talk about how something is affecting everybody now or in the next 10, 20 years, right? So that way they can kind of take action. And to be clear, as we've alluded to, and I want to dig into more, how it's more of a tool for you than it is replacing you. There are a very large number of very common jobs that are going to be replaced by either a version of artificial intelligence or automation. And in many cases, artificial intelligence isn't a helpful new tool for a mortgage loan officer. It might have started off that way, and now it's actually the new mortgage loan officer. Yeah. Bye-bye, Jeff, right? So a decade from now, all indications are that, the first sort of autonomous driving, as much as we've realized how much further we really off our consumer driving, is probably going to be the long haul truck driver, right? Yeah. Because highways are so much less complicated. The problem is truck driver is the most common job in most states in America, from FedEx drivers to actual long haul truckers. It's something like 4 to 6 million jobs. My question is, then turning it back, is why is your profession different? Why does AI remain a tool while you're still running the show?
I mean, to be clear, I think, in the limit of infinite time, we'll all be obsolete. So,
sure. No, we're all turning into like beams of light at some point, no doubt.
Yeah. So there's nothing fundamentally different about my field than, say, any other field. Right. I think that I would say there's maybe sort of two general things, though, that may play a role in some fields versus other fields. One is just how kind of technically challenging, or how much sort of scientific or just technical expertise you need. I mean, machines are good at certain things like pattern recognition, but they're not yet good at like reasoning or logic, those sorts of things. And so if a field requires just a lot of that kind of technical skill, it's just machines just can't yet do it. It's as simple as that. And it's not clear that they can do it in the next 10, 20 years. They might, but there's no clear path that we could see from where we are today to where that is. So that's one class of jobs that I would say is at least for the foreseeable future, somewhat immune. The other is one that sort of requires a lot of human interaction, right? So things that, I mean, you mentioned radiology earlier. So part of a radiologist's job is to interpret, data, but a lot of it has nothing to do with that, right? It has to do with interacting with patients, trying to sort of understand symptoms and diagnosis and that sort of thing, and that is not going away, because that's going to require a lot more development, right? Before a machine could emulate the human interaction component. So those are I would say sort of two classes of jobs that are quite different than say something like truck driving, where like you described may potentially be obsolete in something like 10 years from now.
there's a really interesting, and to be clear, much of the human condition's in a bad way these days. So hopefully we don't replicate it perfectly. But there's this really interesting story, and I'm going to mangle it. I'll try to find the headline for our show notes. Some guy built for, so much of an issue with these huge elderly populations in Japan, and that's growing in the US once the boomers actually get to elderly, and for instance, France, is how isolated they are and the loneliness issues. And ignoring that for 1 second, somebody was trying to deal with just the general day-to-day care that they often need if they're not in sort of a bigger facility that's built for that. If because a lot of these folks have a hard time or will refuse to leave a house they've been in for 30 years. I know it happened with my grandparents. Yeah. So he built these little robots that like drive around their house, and it has a screen, and it can check in on them, or they can ask for something, or they can call a family member or whatever. And very quickly they realized the number one thing the robot was being used for was for these elderly customers / patients were calling customer service all the time. And it was literally just to have somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little, I hope I'm interpreting correctly what you were alluding to with radiologists and the medical profession as far as like a general practitioner, which is the tools are going to be even more and more useful and more accurate and more helpful and save so many lives, or find new treatments or ways of identifying things, or tying different medicines together that, we might not have thought that would go together, like how, Viagra was an accident, penicillin was an accident, things like this. Yeah. But that human experience is not going away, and maybe it can free that profession to become, or liberate that profession to become a little more centered towards that, where you can go to a doctor and be like, he's a genius, his bedside manner sucks, yada, yada, but at least he saved my life. Yeah. Well, maybe we can focus on people that just are better at that part of it, and are relieved from at least wondering, like, am I keeping up with the latest medical journals on what this thing might be?
Yeah, that's actually interesting. And to be honest, I think you're quite right. But this is something that I suspect will be true across a variety of fields, in fact. You mentioned earlier these sort of generative models, things that could generate, deep fakes, like pictures of people or what have you. But there've also been, there's these sort of interesting developments where they allow you to sort of take a very rough sketch of a sort of a landscape and turn it into a high resolution image, right? And that, I think there's an episode in Star Trek some number of years ago that I think had this sort of idea, right? Where
let's do this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Right? Is that as a creative person, maybe you don't need to develop your skills to the point of getting every sort of fine line correct. You just need to have sort of the vision, the idea, the creative spark, and then the machine can sort of take that all the way to a finished product, to a sort of a beautiful image or orchestra or what have you. So
sure.
I think this is going to be true across a wide range of fields where we're going to, in some ways, become more general. We're going to sort of be responsible for the high-level decision-making, but the machines will be responsible for kind of executing all the way down to kind of the fine-grained details. And I think medicine will be an instance of that. That's just one other bit. In the medicine case, there's one other aspect, though, which is that I also think this almost sounds kind of silly, but there's the kind of mechanical aspect, just the fact that you have a human coming in and being able to touch, being able to measure, these sorts of things are actually fairly difficult, surprisingly, in some ways, for machines to do. Robotics is still very much in its infancy, and so the mechanical aspect of a human is something that may prove to be surprisingly durable.
Oh, sure. I mean, look at the Mars rovers. They're incredible feats of engineering and ingenuity, but they drive about 10 feet a day and, can barely pick things up, can't bring anything back. We could walk that far in 5 minutes and accomplish what all these rovers have done in 25 years.
Right, exactly.
But we'd also have to provide oxygen and radiation shielding and all that shit, right? There's pros and cons to both. And I thought about what you were saying too about, again, using it more as a tool. I was reading something the other day about how there's always this. I remember when I first started working and everyone's like, oh, you have to go to business school. And half the people were going, no, you can learn everything you need on the job. and the dichotomy there. And people, there's this argument now about, is it better going forward for training people of the jobs of the future and the problems of the future and things like that to be more of a generalist or to be a specialist? And there was an argument as to why being a generalist would be helpful, because so many of our problems are interconnected in so many ways, and we're finding out more and more of that every day. Why do we have cancer? Oh, it turns out our air's been polluted for 40 years, et cetera, et cetera. That knowing more, knowing a little less about more things, but knowing that there's a tool that can go deep for you should you want to investigate some of these things or tie things together. It seems like we finally have that asset for the first time, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, absolutely, I think the journalists will, there's probably will always be room for a small fraction of the population to be sort of ultra specialized, and these are probably the people who are super, super smart and extremely. But I think for most of us, being a journalist will prove to be a more viable kind of path forward. And it's even things like soft skills, human skills, those sorts of things. I think it's interesting. I always wonder about kind of the trajectory of human history. I think we've certainly through the 20th and 19th centuries started placing more and more emphasis on developing sort of very, very specialized skills, right? On sort of, just the way even society bifurcated into these sort of specialized vocations. But so it's sort of interesting thinking about what that was like 1,000 years ago. I think that was not the case. And I suspect we'll see a reversal where being sort of a well-rounded human being will prove to actually be kind of an asset, because you're able to kind of navigate these complex terrains much more effectively and just rely on machines to kind of take care of the nitty-gritty.
Hopefully, right? And yeah, of course. We're always going to need specialists like you who can actually interpret the data the first time to make it something that the generalists can understand and operate under. But
actually, if I were to take a guess, it's very hard to predict, but if I were to take a guess, I suspect that people like me will probably be obsolete before the generalists. Again, it's hard to say, but I think over a 50-year timeline, say, I think, I'm more likely to be obsolete than someone who's sort of more of a generalist.
I hope you're never obsolete, to be clear.
This is great news for me. I'm definitely a generalist.
That's probably the most gentle way to describe what we do here. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna, if say I'm a young person interested in doing what you do,
who wants to be a specialist, despite what you just said about the obsolete. Why is there hope? Tell us why there's hope and why I should still be excited.
Wait, sorry, hope in the sense that like why this is interesting to do, or hope why there's still a viable career path?
Both.
I think it's of course going to remain interesting because we still have so far to go, despite everything you've done. Not knocking your accomplishments, more like because of the tools that are now available, and because of having so far to go means we still have so much opportunity. But yeah, why is it? I guess if I'm understanding it right, why is it viable as a career profession? If anything, more viable and exciting than it was before. Is that true or false?
Well, to be sure. We don't know. I think what's happened in the last 10 years in artificial intelligence is amazing, but we still don't have a clear path forward from where we are today to sort of artificial general intelligence. So what I was talking to about earlier, in terms of logic, in terms of reasoning, these sorts of skills, they're still very much the purview of humans. We don't have any competition really yet, and it's not clear that that's going to change in 20, 30 years. So that's the primary reason why I would say it's like a viable career path. That we don't. There's no machine right now today that can sort of do what I do or what people like me do, and I it's not. There's no sort of. The writing is not on the wall in the sense that, we can just see that we can scale things up and get to a point where machines can do what we do. But my statement earlier was more just, it's a relative statement. Just saying one or the other, I would suspect that the specialist would sort of go the way of the dodo before the generalist. But I think if I were advising somebody today to start college or high school, I would still and if they have the aptitude and the interest, I would still very much tell them to go into this space, because I think the upshot is amazing. There's so much that we still have to do, and if we succeed, like I was talking about earlier, I think we could really we could make life a lot better for a lot of people.
Doesn't sound terrible.
It's pretty admirable.
Yeah. How should I be proactively trying to...
Not you, Brian.
Yeah, no, me.
Oh, sure. Okay. Go for it, champ.
Trying to engage these new tools and disciplines to get ahead and to make a dent in something like protein folding?
Well, so there's a few things. I mean, I would say more broadly, if you think about the health space, what I think is interesting are these new platforms that are being developed, and there are some privacy issues here to be sure, but there are these new platforms that basically sort of allow people to provide their data in a way that's anonymized or what have you, to sort of build databases that could associate things like genotypes with phenotypes. So, for example, in the US, we have the what is it called? All of Us. That's it's an initiative. I think it started out in the Obama administration. But basically, this initiative that's trying to collect data from, I think, 100,000 or even 1 million people eventually, to associate the genotypes with phenotypes. And that's a great thing. You can just go in and sign up for it online. And it's, you get all these wonderful measurements taken that actually would cost a lot of money for free, and you get to have access to all your data as well. And that's something that's actually, it sounds maybe a bit surprising, but we're in dire need of, because in the biomedical community right now, everything is very fragmented. Each hospital has its own data, and for the most part, hospitals don't really share data with one another. So it's very difficult for researchers to be able to actually apply these wonderful developments in machine learning to things like health. But if more people were to participate, and if we're able to kind of on a national level build databases that again sort of protect privacy, but also kind of expose important patterns, then I think that could be a win-win.
Yeah, you hope so. And we had a couple conversations with some brilliant women over the NHS, talking about how data sharing actually is the default when you're born over there, which is interesting, and how that is now a really interesting case study compared to here, where it's opt-in here versus there it's opt-out. And while they have a much more homogeneous population and obviously much smaller population, what they're already able to start doing with that data, because it's a much more comprehensive, if not completely comprehensive, swath of their population there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Iceland is probably the best example of this, because they have this remarkable kind of ability to collect data on people, and it's just, like you said, and the population is much more homogeneous, so you're actually able to kind of infer interesting relationship between within individuals in the population and so on. And to be honest, I mean, these things do raise important privacy issues, but what we're talking about in the context of the U.S., at least, I think it's in some ways much simpler. We're just asking for a lot less. It's not even because you don't have a homogeneous population. You're not so much worried about being able to tell who's related to whom or that sort of thing. It's much more about these kind of disease associations that are very hard to do right now, because we just don't have enough data to actually to discover these patterns.
Do you think that we are at least making strides toward some serious advances in these places, that it is worth some of the privacy trade-offs that people are scared of? Is it something where you could say, like, look, I know it's scary, but it could be so worth it in the near future? Are we close to that? Is that a leg to stand on?
So I would say two things. I mean, the answer to your question, I think, is yes. I mean, I think we definitely there's definitely a lot to do, and I think we are at the cusp of making some important discoveries based on the technologies we've sort of been developing over the last 2 decades. So I do think that, I mean, people have always been saying, cure to cancer has got it on the corner or whatever, and it's sort of never materialized. But I do think that the next 10, 20 years we will see some kind of really exciting and practical progress. But I'm not sure that the premise is correct of your question. I don't actually think there are any sort of real privacy trade-offs. I think we could do this in a way that is almost completely. So there are different versions of this, but I think we can get 90% of the way there without sacrificing almost any of our privacy. So and this is part of why I think much of the problem really has less to do with. I mean, I think people are often quite willing to share an anonymized way. The problem has more to do with different institutions, different hospitals, different research institutions sharing information. They tend to not want to do that, and that's why I think we need something like a national. And we do have this national effort now, because that would sort of by construction ensure that data is actually being shared. So the problem is not even so much privacy. I think it's just really sort of different groups kind of being very protective of the data they have, not because they're worried about patient privacy, but because they want to maintain their edge. So it's just like a selfish thing.
Interesting. That's it. That's a much more rational perspective on it. I feel like from a consumer standpoint, it's less like I want to give up my data and more, from Target to Home Depot to Yahoo, they see these data breaches and go, well, that's what fucking happens when I give up my data.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is probably the scare point for more folks is like, well, shit, now if I'm going to start giving up my medical data, what happens when that gets lost? Obviously, these companies are now, every time that happens, I think these companies are doubling down more and more and more on security and various locksteps for it. But I can empathize with it, but also, again, can see the power of how close we are on some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tricky thing with financial data, for example, is that it cannot be anonymized, right? So right. I think that's a big difference here. Is that the point is not to maintain something like your credit card score for like your health. That I think would be a bad thing. It's right. or at least it's unnecessary anyway. It's more is just to collect data in bulk and to be able to discover patterns, but without even being able to, even in principle, to work back, who has what disease or that sort of thing. That I think is unnecessary. And so that's why I'm saying I think we could do it in a way which really should not have any privacy sort of implications. At least, 99% of the privacy questions or issues could be resolved.
Feels like we need more people like you to explain that point to folks, because I think that makes a lot more sense, which is like, we don't want your social security number.
No, absolutely. Right.
That's not actually going to help us,
Yeah. But see, it's a bit complicated, right? Because if you're, for example, if you were to send your data to a consumer genetics company, that's a different calculation, right? Because they are in fact interested in maintaining that association. So this is, it sounds like I'm sort of beating a dead horse, but this is why I think the national effort is a bit different, right? Because if the intention from the get-go is not to monetize this, but instead to say we want to collect this data for research purposes, and so we're really going to do it in a way which maybe is not particularly sort of useful for commercial applications, and so we'll lose some edge. But from the kind of scientific side, we could do it in a way that safeguards the privacy concerns, while at the same time being almost as good as having the full anonymized data there.
Sure. So in your profession so far, but besides DeepMind showing up and blowing up your spot, what are the biggest obstacles you do run into in your job on sort of a day-to-day and a long-term basis? We want people to understand it's not all roses over there with your protein folding.
No, absolutely not. And that's actually part of what made the DeepMind entry sort of very interesting in a way, because I think it highlighted structural inefficiencies and structural problems in the way academic research is done. So to answer your question, one common problem that I think almost all academic researchers complain about is access to computing resources. We're actually, relative to companies, we have a lot more limited access to compute to be able to sort of carry out these very large computations. And this may sound like a very sort of technical issue, but in fact, it's become really sort of the bloodline of computational research. And frankly, computer science has been having to deal with this for the last maybe 10 years, because there's been this almost exodus of academic researchers from universities to companies, precisely because of the resources that they're able to amass or to leverage in companies. And I think we're beginning to see that in biology as well. So that's something that we sort of run into every day, and it's something that I think will require, again, something more of a national effort at the level of the Department of Energy or the National Institute of Health to sort of say, okay, this is a serious issue, and we need to be able to provide these resources so that academic research can sort of compete at the highest levels with industry. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is just sort of software infrastructure. The way sort of academic incentives are structured. People are incentivized to create novel pieces of software or novel research ideas, but they're not incentivized to create robust software that actually works and that people want to use. And so there's this very strange thing where academic software is sort of synonymous with being sort of very fragile and practically useless and hard to use, and that holds the field back. There's no reason for it to be this way. And again, sort of going back to DeepMind. What they understand this issue very well, and they've built sort of a cadre of software engineers that are able to go in and sort of engineer things that are very robust and that can scale and that allow their researchers to actually operate at a very high level, while academic researchers, on the other hand, are sort of left in the dust because we just don't have access to this human resource. So these are issues that I think the scientific enterprise as a whole and the funding agencies in particular can pay a lot more attention to sort of restructure the way science is done so that academia is a healthier place.
Well, and that's what happened with Uber and Carnegie Mellon 7-8 years ago now, right? Because they just completely decimated that entire department by hiring everyone for their self-driving car unit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just, that's probably the most extreme example, but frankly, almost all the top elite universities, they've really suffered, especially in the CS departments, computer science departments, precisely for this reason. Yeah,
it's an issue. So things to fix. Brian, go ahead.
Let's get into some action steps here. All right, we always want to end this with things that our listeners can do to support your mission, actual actions that they can take, and we like to say that they can use their voice, their vote, and their dollar. So let's get into that. Let's start with their voice. What are big, actionable, and specific questions that we should all be asking of our representatives in an effort to support you?
Yeah, to be honest, my answer will be very general. I think basic science is important, and we ought to fund it more. And there's a slight distinction there, where I think there is arguably a reasonable amount of funding. There can always be more for kind of clinical or for biomedical research, but the kind of basic questions tend to be sort of left behind, and that I think is very short-sighted because ultimately the long-term breakthroughs, things like CRISPR, we talked about that earlier, have come from people asking very fundamental questions that don't necessarily, at least initially, have any connection to sort of practical matters. So I would say, tell your representatives to support investment in basic science and to actually increase funding for basic science because and science funding in general, because it's one of the few things where I think the return on investment is almost guaranteed. It's one of those things where of all things you can spend your money on, I think research is one of those fairly safe bets.
We've gotten that answer a lot, which is just tell them to support basic science funding because it's almost like you just never know what you're going to get out of it. There's no wrong that can be done there.
Right.
Yeah, it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but historically this has not been the case that basic science has had sort of anemic funding, like the anemic funding that we see now. But there has been this shift, and particularly in the last decade, I would say, especially in the life sciences, where practically everything you do now has to cure cancer. And I think that's really sort of short-sighted. I'm not entirely sure whether the forces at play that sort of led to this situation. And partly, obviously, it's a lot easier to sort of justify to taxpayer saying, "Oh, I'm going to cure disease," than I'm going to discover some new form of bacteria. But the point is to kind of try to communicate this truth that progress does seem to come from asking basic questions. So the more we know about how the world works, the more we're able to make progress in very applied areas of research.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I guess we can, as we move on to vote here, we can kind of there's a similarity there. Vote for people who are supporting this but are there specific, scientific perspectives that are missing from our elected representatives?
Well, yeah, I was going to say. I do think when it comes to voting, I would actually say vote for people who are scientifically aware and progressive and so on. And the obvious things that need not be said. But I would also say, actually, if you have a scientist running in your district, give them a serious look, because I think scientists as a community bring a certain perspective, including to policymaking, that may be quite fresh, that is quite different than say somebody who's spent their entire career in politics or in business. And I think as a whole, scientists are sort of very much underrepresented in Congress. So it's not just about them being pro-science. That's one aspect of it, but also just about them having a different, sort of a more evidence-based perspective on things. I think they're less likely to be sort of driven by sort of emotional currents and more likely to be sort of thoughtful about how to approach a given problem. And I think that's a good thing to have in general.
I mean, I would like to scream that from the rooftops. It seems like duh, right? It's insane that that the number of scientists that are in office it's crazy low. I forgot what this the stat is, but it's just mind blowing.
Well, and it's great that people are in their jobs doing science, but at the same time, like we had a conversation last fall with a gentleman, Sean Casten, who's now Representative Sean Casten.
That's right, Illinois.
From Illinois, who ran for office, and part of his platform was like, look, I've built clean energy. Like that was my job.
Yeah.
My perspective is inherently extremely valuable in the conversations we're going to be having over the next 5-10 years, because I've actually done this and I can speak it and I can understand it. I don't have to have like Science 101 come to my office to tell me how a windmill works.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be all those people, but the more of it, look at Representative Underwood, the young black nurse who made it in, and we're trying to fix healthcare, and that perspective is certainly super helpful. Someone who's in it and doing it every day. So
yeah, and I think it's especially true in our very polarized environment. Right? The problem is I think we've just become too emotionally kind of caught up in the moment, and we're not able. I mean, this sounds a bit cliched, but it's true. I mean, I think we're just not really talking to one another across the sort of ideological divide, and so it's not even about right versus. I mean, that's one issue, right versus left, but it's just it's a matter of being able to kind of take a step back and just sort of rationally think about something and not get caught up in the tribal kind of warfare that our country is descended into. So that that alone, I think, just by itself would be a worthwhile thing to sort of have in Congress. And I should say, I think after 2016, I mean, my sense is, at least within my circle, I feel like there's been a lot more scientists are sort of getting interested in this. So that's great to see more people getting engaged in policy and thinking, okay, maybe we can contribute in this way instead of just doing research. And so that's, I think there is a positive sort of development in that direction, but I think it needs to go much, much further.
Yeah, it's a nice start. And one of the good things that came out of that election is just how more fired up people were, especially scientists.
Yeah, absolutely.
We work with a great group called 314 Action and 314 Pi. They work explicitly to support scientists and things like that getting into office, seeing the huge dearth that exists there.
Yeah. Mohammed, what about money? What can our listeners do with their dollars? Anything specific, outside of the box where we could send some cash?
That's an interesting question. So there are organizations. I don't know that they're taking donations, but I thought I should call them out because I think they're doing very good work.
Please.
One of which is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I mentioned earlier this whole problem of so if you're not familiar with them, they're sort of this part research institute, part philanthropic organization founded by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, and one of the interesting things I think they sort of zeroed in on is this question of being able to provide sort of software development, software expertise as kind of a general good to the scientific community with no strings attached. I think they understand the value of having that sort of resource be sort of publicly available. I don't know if they take donations, but I think we need sort of more organizations like them that sort of support science while sort of being kind of aware of the structural inefficiencies that it has, and sort of trying to actually be sort of intelligent about how to address these specific inefficiencies.
I think one of my friends runs PR for them, and they do some really interesting stuff over there.
Yeah, cool,
awesome. We can't thank you enough for your time here today, Mohammed. We just have just a few more questions for you. If you can think of anybody else, and you can send us to us later, but we always love getting recommendations from our current guests about other groundbreaking, world-changing folks out there that we would love to talk to, that our listeners would love to hear from. If you have any ideas on that, we would love to have them.
There's so many interesting people. Can I send you a list later?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Please.
Yeah, for sure.
That'd be wonderful.
Absolutely. You can't put Brian on that list. We've already talked to Brian.
I'm always on this thing.
It doesn't count.
Are you ready for a lightning round, Mohammed?
Sure.
It's not a lightning round, but we called it that because I haven't changed it in 72 episodes. Mohammed,
okay.
When was the first time in your life when you realized you had the power of change or the power to do something meaningful?
I think 13 years old. You want to know the context?
Yes,
Hell
please.
Yeah. Hit us.
This is going to sound strange, but I was trying to get my green card at the time. I was still, I was young. Obviously, my parents were trying to get a green card because we had just immigrated to this country. And
where are you from? I'm sorry, Mohammed.
Yeah, sure. I'm from Iraq originally.
Okay.
And at the time that the setup was, you actually have to line up in the middle of the night, starting at 10 p.m. In front of the immigration office to wait to get in for your interview. So it's a very bizarre thing where you have to line up, from 10 p.m. and the interview is usually like at 10 a.m. So you're spending like 12 hours, in the middle of it's really stupid. But anyway, so I was there, and I think around 3 or 4 a.m. we decided to go to sort of this nearby McDonald's, and there were, a bunch of people there, people from sort of low means. And it just sort of struck me that at that moment that there's so much that I could sort of do to sort of fix these problems that I see around me. I saw at the time all these homeless people at McDonald's, and I kind of contrasted it with my situation, and of course my situation was infinitely better. But it's sort of the fact that I was there in the middle of the night, seeing these people kind of opened up this kind of perspective that I hadn't seen before. It's almost this world that I didn't know existed, and that just kind of made me feel like I ought to dedicate my life to something that is worthwhile. That I should try to do something with my life.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty wonderful.
I think it's insane that that's the process for the interview. I'm glad that you had that moment because clearly a lot of folks are going to benefit from it.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Mohammed, along those lines, who is someone in your life that has positively impacted your work in the past 6 months?
There's a fellow here at where I work. He's a professor. His name is Peter Sorger. And he's just really been, over the last 6 months, even longer, I would say he's just been a really wonderful mentor. He's been somebody who sort of, I think, kind of believed in the kind of science that I was doing, even though it was very risky, and sort of helped support me in this enterprise. And even though when he didn't need to, it was sort of very much a bet on, because the work I do is quite different than the work he does. So it was very much kind of a bet on the person as opposed to, anything else. And I think I would say, without that support, I wouldn't be where I am. So that's who I would say.
That's pretty rad.
Great answer. Mohammed, what do you do when you feel overwhelmed?
Which everybody talks about self-care these days. When things get to be too much, you go on a run, play video games, eat a bunch of ice cream. What's your ball game?
He doesn't need suggestions. So
I think I ought to. Playing video games would be a good idea. I don't actually do it nearly as much as I ought to. I was a gamer, but I can't call myself that anymore. Probably today it would be more like reading or just listening to a book on Audible or just reading a book. Just thinking about something else. Strangely, I find that when I'm engaged with someone else's problem very seriously, that helps me relax because I love solving problems, but my own problems tend to stress me out. So when I'm somehow focused on someone else's, I get to do what I like without having to have that stress. So that's a little bit different than reading the books. There's two things, I guess: reading books and solving someone else's problem.
I love that. My wife and I are both writers, and she always talks about how her favorite thing to do is to work on other people's shit because it means she doesn't have to do her shit.
Right, exactly.
Love it. Speaking of books, you mentioned books. If you could Amazon Prime one book to Donald Trump, what book would it be?
Anything. We've had everything from cram books to the Constitution.
I don't know if he'll benefit from it. I would say maybe a better Angels of Our Nature. Just because I think it's such a rational take on things, a rationalist take on things. But I don't know if he'll make a dent.
Why do you feel that way?
What do you mean?
but it's I think it's a book that a lot of people should read because it's even if not all the facts are right, I think it's a good way it's a good way of thinking. It's a good way to sort of train your mind, and I think that's a good thing to have. That's by Steve Pinker, by the way. If it's not,
Yeah, that's a good one. Hey, last question. Anything else you would like to say to any way you want to use this podcast to speak truth to power? Last things to our listeners.
Yeah, look, I think the future can be very bright. I don't want to go out on a limb and say it will be bright. I don't know that that's true, but I do think we are living in sort of very transformative times, and I think the challenges are great, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I do think that if we sort of do this right, we stand to gain quite a lot. And like I started out in this discussion, I feel like we really can. We're at this precipice where we can almost redefine what it means to be humans and who we are and what our future is as a species. And that's incredibly exciting. It's an opportunity that I think few other humans have had, throughout our existence. So I'm optimistic at the opportunity, at least. And I hope that speaking of better angels, I hope that our better angels will come to the fore, and that we will see our way through this time.
I love it. Hopefully it's a message we can print on billboards everywhere.
Yeah. Mohammed, where can our listeners follow you online?
Probably Twitter is the best place to follow me online. I have a blog post as well, but that tends to be a bit more technical, and I don't update it all that frequently. But my Twitter on Mohammed AlQuraishi is probably the best place to follow me.
Awesome. We will
very good.
Put that in the show notes.
And then, one more question. Are you able to make a deep fake for me of Quinn telling me that he loves me and I'm the best?
Nope, we're not doing that right now, Brian.
Got it. Okay.
Nope. That's not what he's here for.
No problem.
Great.
Thought I'd ask.
Mohammed, yep, just sneak it in.
Yeah.
Mohammed, thank you so much, obviously, for being here today with all your travel fun. I'm sure you're like not even unpacked. And
I'm very jet lagged. Yeah.
Oh God, I can't. It's the worst.
I'm half asleep right now. But.
Perfect. I'm half asleep every day. Brian doesn't get up before 10. Thank you so much for your time, and obviously for all you're doing every day and the perspective you bring to it. I think and I hope we can all learn from it. Again, we've got some serious shit going on, but as you alluded to, man, if we can get past some of it, there's a pretty magical future out there, and hopefully it's a lot more equitable and just for more folks out there as well.
I think so, and I hope so. And thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed this conversation as well.
Okay.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we will talk to you again soon once you fix and solve the whole thing. No biggie.
Sounds good.
Thanks to our incredible guest today, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope this episode has made your commute or awesome workout or dishwashing or fucking dog walking late at night that much more pleasant. As a reminder, please subscribe to our free email newsletter at importantnotimportant.com. It is all the news most vital to our survival as a species.
And you can follow us all over the internet. You can find us on Twitter at importantnotimp.
Just
so weird. Also on Facebook and Instagram at Important Not Important. Pinterest and Tumblr, the same thing. So check us out, follow us, share us, like us. You know the deal. And please subscribe to our show wherever you listen to things like this. And if you're really fucking awesome, rate us on Apple Podcasts. Keep the lights on. Thanks.
Please.
And you can find the show notes from today right in your little podcast player and at our website, importantnotimportant.com.
Thanks to the very awesome Tim Blaine for our jammin' music, to all of you for listening, and finally, most importantly, to our moms for making us. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.